We're back with the Chad Hasty Show. This is Scott Mann, the Sandstorm Scholar. Matt Crow is here with me, and we're going to go straight to our phone line and talk to Al Pickett. Al Pickett, you're on the air.
Good morning. How are you?
I am well. Good morning.
Al, it's Matt Crow. How you been?
I'm doing terrific. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, tell us what you did this weekend. I know you spoke to a group. Tell us about that real quick.
I was at the Texas Sports Hall of Fame in Waco, and they had their first annual book festival, and I was one of, I think, about 17 different authors that were there to speak and tell about my new book, The Mighty Matadors, and so I had a chance to meet people, sign copies of the book, and tell the story of the Mighty Matadors.
I had a terrific face-to-face meeting with Joe Rose, and talked about the book and read the book. I have got to say, and I said this earlier, that after reading the book, I don't know if you started it out this way, but I came away with some life lessons. Did you think you'd get to that point with the book? I mean, when you first started writing it, did you set out to write a kind of a not ethical and a moral tale and a tale about friendships and people's emotions?
Well, when I first was invited, it's been several years ago, was invited up. Coach Keeling, who was the coach of that team, I covered for 21 years at Hardin-Simmons, and the guys wanted to do a book, and I think they kind of had that vision of some life lessons, and certainly to tell the story of their state championship. And then so I went up and met with them, and it became very immediately clear to me what great friends they were and the friendships they had developed over time. And then as I went to do the book, and obviously you're telling the story of a state championship team, but I wanted it to be a lot more, and setting against the turbulent times that were 1967 and 68, which were two of the craziest, wildest years in American history. And so, but this team blocked all that out and became the best football team they could be. So, no, it kind of evolved over time, but I was very pleased with the final product.
Set the stage, Estacado High School, 1966, 1967.
Okay, well, 1967 is when it opened in the fall, and the University Interscholastic League was 1967 was the first year that it integrated. Before that, the all-black schools competed in the Prairie View Interscholastic League, and at that point, Lubbock ISD had Dunbar, an all-black school, and then Coronado and Monterey were all-white schools, and Lubbock High had just a handful of black students, but basically was an all-white school. So Estacado was going to be their experiment into integration, and so they opened that school. Coach Keeling was hired in January prior to the school opening, and so that became Lubbock's first foray into integration. Later, the Justice Department came in and eventually forced busing and an integration of all the schools. But at the time, it was simply Estacado was the integration. And of course, unlike most towns, like Abilene, where I live, Wichita Falls, Odessa, like most of the towns that closed their all-black high schools in 67, that's when most of them around the state did, from the Civil Rights Act signed by President Johnson. But Lubbock kept Dunbar open, so Dunbar stayed open until the early 90s.
You know, one thing that struck me in the book is the kind of the ensemble cast of characters. You write about a lot of, most of the players, the cheerleaders, the coaches, the parents, so on and so forth. Who in your mind kind of sticks out, though, in the book as kind of carrying the torch for the Mighty Matadors? I mean, where did they get their inspiration from?
Well, I think they got it from Coach Keeling. I think more than anything else, that he basically came in and said, we're going to work hard and be a football team, and it didn't matter what color you were or who you were or where you're from. So I think that set the tone. I think certainly team leaders, you'd have to thank Joe Rose, who you mentioned, who was a center and later the student body president at Estacado, Kenneth Wallace, who was the quarterback just by the very nature of being a quarterback. David Moody, I think, was a team leader who still coaches there at Lubbock High, and Fred White, who was probably their defensive leader. So I think those are kind of the players that stood out as I was doing the research on the book.
You mentioned that during one of the games, Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, think about what 1968 was like. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were both assassinated prior to the start of the 68 football season. I was a freshman in high school at that time, and I think all we knew about was on television, but the Vietnam War protests were going on, the civil rights movement. It was just a year of a lot of change and upheaval, and I think a lot of schools during that integration time had problems, and not that Estacado didn't have problems, but the football team blocked all that out and became a close-knit, and that's the thing that maybe impressed me more than anything is how close-knit those guys are still today, 50 years later.
That's one of the takeaways I had, is that the strong bonds that they built together. I don't know if they were aware of it at the time. Did you get a sense that they knew that they'd be friends for life at that point, or did it just kind of transition that way?
I don't think they thought that. I think they were living in the moment. I mean, think back when you were in high school. We weren't thinking too far ahead at that time. I think that just kind of evolved over time, and they went through so much together and had that great success in the 14-0 state championship season that but I don't know that they envisioned that. I mean, they can answer better than I can, but I would guess that no, they did not envision that when they were juniors in high school.
We're talking to Al Pickett, who's the author of the Mighty Matadors, the story of the Estacado football team, 1967-1968, which is kind of a insight spotlight into the turbulent of the 60s and segregation and desegregation. But as much as the book deals with that, I just, my own personal reaction to the book was the personal relationships and what it meant to be a white kid in Lubbock at that point in time, and a black kid in Lubbock at that time, and the communities that were separated. And how, but as you related to it on the football field and the coach, once you walked onto the school property, all that kind of faded into the background.
Yeah, they said when they got on the football field, they were blue and silver. They were not black and white and brown. So you're exactly right, and that's I think one of the things I really tried to point out in the book was how this team came together regardless of what else was happening in the outside world away from them.
I would imagine you've worked on and I know you've published other books. How is this book different from your works right now?
Well, in some ways it's very different. In some ways it's kind of similar. I've written 5 books, and every one of them either directly or indirectly have dealt with a state championship team. But this is certainly the most unique state championship team because it was the whole background of integration involved in that.
Tell us a little bit about what happened to the coach and some of the players, what they went on to do.
Well, Joe Rose has been a very successful businessman, has moved back to Lubbock recently. Kenneth Wallace, the quarterback, is now the assistant superintendent at the Galena Park ISD in suburban Houston. Most of the players all went on to be very successful in their various careers in a whole wide variety of things. And Coach Keeling went on to a career that spanned over 50 years. He coached at a number of high schools, I think, for like 35 years, and then he spent the last 21 years of his career as the head coach at Hardin-Simmons. He started that program from scratch, so he had experience doing that because he did that at Estacado. And then when he retired, he was the all-time winningest coach at Hardin-Simmons and the 6th winningest active coach in NCAA Division III. So he continued to have great success in his coaching career after Estacado.
Al, this is Scott Mann. I'm curious, how unique is this story? Even taking the background of the 60s out of it, in terms of the second year this school was in existence, and I assume the first year they played varsity football.
That's right.
They win the state championship. Talk about that.
Well, how unique it is. It's the only time it's happened in UIL history. It's never happened any other time. And just think about it. Not only are the only school to win a state football championship in their first year of varsity football, but they're also the only Lubbock ISD team to win a state football championship since they opened a second high school back in 1955 after Lubbock High won in 52. So it's very unique. I mean, it's almost unheard of to have a school that is playing its first season of varsity football, and they played a JV schedule in '67, and that's very typical of a new school that opens, plays a JV schedule. Monterey and Coronado did the same thing. That they play with mostly freshmen and sophomores, and then they play that JV schedule. Then the next year they play their first varsity season. But nobody other than Estacado's ever won a state championship in that first year.
Great story. Can we impose on you to stay over for the next segment?
Sure, absolutely.
We'd like to keep you. This is Al Pickett. The book is The Mighty Matadors. You need to read it. You can get it from Amazon. You can get it right here at Barnes & Noble. I picked mine up last week at Barnes & Noble. If you're interested in Lubbock, if you're interested in football, or you just want to read a heartwarming story, this is it, and we're going to have more from Al Pickett. This is the Chad Hasty Show on 95.1 FM, 790 AM KFYO, and we'll be back with more.
And we're back on the Chad Hasty Show. Scott Mann and Matt Crow substituting for Chad this morning. Chad will be back tomorrow at 8:30. We're broadcasting from the Culligan Water Studios, better water, pure and simple. And we're talking to Al Pickett, who's the author of The Mighty Matadors, a terrific book, as we were talking about earlier, talking about football, loyalty, value, and ethics against the backdrop of the late 60s. A lot of you remember. I don't particularly ever want to go back to the late 60s. I don't think that was a particularly great time in our country, but I guess we're the better for it.
We survived it.
Yeah.
I wrote an article recently about 1968 and how it is the worst it's ever been in my memory.
Al, not being a Texan, I'm a transplant by way of California and Virginia, but Texas high school football, I'd always heard about it. I'd seen movies about it. I'd seen TV series about it, but nothing prepares you until you actually live here. What is it about Texas high school football in 30 words or less?
Well, I'm the same way. I'm a transplant. I grew up in Kansas. I've been in Abilene, Texas for 31 years and covered high school football, and there's nothing like it. I mean, it's just if I always said in the season opener, I broadcast games now, and if you hear the national anthem, the team takes the field at the start of the high school football season, that doesn't get your blood boiling. There's something wrong with you. It's just there's nothing like it when you have stadiums that seat 15,000, 18,000 for high school football. You tell people that in other states, and they have no concept of it. And then look at the crowds we have at AT&T Stadium now for the state championship games.
770-5790 is the call-in line, 770-5790. If you'd like to talk to Al Pickett, author of The Mighty Matadors. Al, was the team talent, inspiration, or just good timing? Or was it the coach, as you said earlier? Was it a combination of all three? What was the horsepower under the hood for that team?
I think there was a combination of all. They had great speed, and they had a lot of talent. There's no doubt about it, but they had to come together. There's lots of teams that have had talent and haven't won it. Now, listen how dominating this team was. They outscored their opponents that year 552-32. Wow. That's domination. And they were thought to originally going to be in 4A, which was the largest classification at the time, and probably in part because of white flight. When the UIL realignment numbers came out in the spring before the 68 season, they were put into Class 3A. And here's an amazing thing. As you all know, now we have 5, 6, 7-team districts with 4 teams making the playoffs. They were put into an 11-team district. They had no non-district games, 10 district games, and 1 team went to the playoffs. So they really went into the last game against Sweetwater, who may have been the second best team in the state. They went into that game having to win to even make the playoffs. So it was a little bit of a combination of everything, I think.
And, I thought a really neat angle to the book was you get into the players' families, you get into people who weren't on the football field, you get into the cheerleaders, you get into the principals, you get into the guys who, cleaned up the school and so on and so forth. It sounds kind of corny, but when it comes right down to it, nobody takes credit for how great the team was singularly. It was just a family out there.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I'm proud of. And thanks to Joe Rose and David Moody and some of the guys that helped line some other people up, I talked to just ordinary students. And one of the things that jumped out at me, it was not the black students adjusting to the white students. It was both adjusting to the other, learning from the culture of the other, and how much that they all bonded together. Then the other thing I think that was fascinating to me is once they finished that regular season 10-0, how the community kind of rallied around them, and all of a sudden they became such a huge story where, you know, the cheerleaders and student body presidents from the other schools in town came to speak at their pep rallies. I mean, goodness, the the governor-elect came and spoke at a pep rally that they had. So they certainly captured the imagination of the community, I think.
Now, I know Joe Rose has been talking to folks at LISD about an event at Estacado coming up in the next couple of months to kind of celebrate the team's victory, celebrate the book. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know a lot. Tentatively, it's set for August the 22nd, and it's going to be a celebration of not only the state championship, but the 50th anniversary of Estacado High School opening in the fall of '67. So right now it looks like that that morning of the August the 22nd, there's going to be a big celebration. I don't even know what all's involved, and then we'll all be selling books and then signing copies of the book at that time as well.
That sounds wonderful, and as we learn more about it, we will bring that news to you. Texas high school football, better, worse, about the same as it was 30 years ago?
Oh, I think it's probably better. I mean, good grief, the kids, I think they had only a small handful of players over 200 pounds. Look at the size of the kids now. I think everything gets bigger and bigger, and it's bigger and better. It's Texas football, you know,
right.
But I think it's probably better, but that doesn't diminish at all what this team accomplished and what an amazing story this team is.
Al, talk just a minute about Coach Keeling. As a nondescript former Texas high school football player, I know that there are few words in the English language passed after mother that are dearer than coach. I mean, it's almost a sacred word in Texas high schools. Talk about Coach Keeling.
Well, I think maybe the thing, and I told this story at the Texas Sports Hall of Fame on Saturday, but every time I'm with Coach Keeling, and we're together quite often, his cell phone rings, and it's a former player wanting advice on looking for a new job or wanting to talk to him about this. The bond that he has with players, and he remembers them all. I think he coached for 56 years or whatever. I mean, these guys, and I'm talking about guys from 68, but from all over, everywhere. It's amazing, the bond he has with his former players.
I'm going to ask you to hang on for just one more break. We'll be back. We'll finish up the hour. We've got Al Pickett, Mighty Matadors. This is the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk KFYO.
And you're back on the Chad Hasty Show with Scott Mann and Matt Crow substituting for Chad Hasty. On the phone, we've got Al Pickett, who is the author of the Mighty Matadors. Al, we've got about 40 seconds left. And tell us, other books you've written besides the Mighty Matadors for the listeners?
I wrote Team of the Century about the Abilene High team of the 50s. I wrote The Greatest Texas Sports Stories You've Never Heard, which is a collection of stories. I co-wrote Emory Billard's autobiography called Wishbone Wisdom. He's the coach who invented the wishbone. And then I wrote a book called Brothers Keeper about the Abilene High State Championship team of 2009, and it is going to be made into a movie. Hopefully this fall filming will begin.
Terrific. That's Al Pickett. You've been listening to 95.1 KFYO News Talk. 95.1 FM, 790 AM. Thank you very much, Al, and we'll keep everybody up to date on what's going to happen with the Matadors and Estacado for the ceremony. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed being on with you.